Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Biodiversity. How does it help create the world's most special places? Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader, Eleanor Edye. It's always a pleasure, Eleanor. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thanks very much, Kendall, and thanks everybody for showing up today. Firstly, a happy Victoria Day to all of you. I'm coming at you from Canada, and it is our national holiday marking the beginning of summer here. And I am looking out the window at a very summery landscape, so I can't wait to get out and explore my own special place later on today. So today, like Kendall mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about biodiversity, starting off with what that means, but then getting into what that looks like when we head out in the world and look at some of those very special, diverse places. Because while all places are special, some places are more special than others, especially how it concerns biodiversity. So to start off with, what is biodiversity? It's a huge concept. And we use this word a lot, right? We use it when we talk about the number of species or how many things we can see when we look out the window, but it's actually a lot larger of a concept than that. So it's meant to, it's a contraction for biological diversity. The term's only been around since the mid-1980s, and it's meant to encompass the variety of life on Earth at all the levels. So all the way, from viruses and bacteria to our largest organisms, the blue whales, but not just the variety of those organisms themselves, but also within those forms and within the different relationships and interactions that they have. So, like I say, it's a very broad definition, and we usually have three main ways that we can think about it when we start to think about what biodiversity can look like out there in the world. And the first way we can examine biodiversity is by looking at genetic richness. So this is a measurement of the number of potential genes within a species. If you were to, zoom right in and look at the DNA as part of the chromosomes on different members of a population of a species, how often would those base pairs be different? So really getting down to that basic building block of life and looking at the diversity there. And we know even just from thinking about domestic animals, whether it's cats or dogs or chickens, especially where humans have come in and found those variations and bred for them, that there can be extreme variation in what those genes can actually present as. Whether it's, as we have here with dogs, big dogs, small dogs, fluffy dogs, hairless dogs, different eye colors, different behaviors. And while we see it most with dogs, some of the most diverse organisms on Earth are things that to the naked eye probably wouldn't look very diverse to you or me. So what you're looking at right here, it's a mushroom, right? And it's a mushroom known by the name Schizophilum commune. So it's a common mushroom, and it is actually, as far as we know, the most genetically diverse species on the planet. If you were to take any two random mushrooms and measure the DNA bases and record them as you go along, 20 times out of 100, they would have different DNA pairs at the same points in their chromosome relative to other members of their species. So 20% is actually incredibly diverse. We would call this a hyper diverse species. And if you compare that to humans, humans have a genetic diversity of actually only about 0.1%. Meaning if you were to measure my DNA relative to anybody else on the planet, we're only going to differ at those base pairs about 1 time out of 1,000. This is actually really wacky for us to think about sometimes, and it's really showing us how new on the scene humans are as a species. We haven't had a lot of time to have those significant mutations. We've also had really stable population sizes since we've spread out, so we're not very diverse compared to an organism like this. Now, on the flip side of this, what are some of the least diverse organisms that we can see around the planet? They tend to be the ones that are already of note for conservation reasons. So here you're seeing a cheetah And cheetahs are known for having very, very low levels of genetic variation between individuals. So I said that mushroom, the schizophilum, was around 20% variation, humans around 0.1% variation. With cheetahs, we're only looking at a variation of about 0.02%. And this is because of past population bottlenecks, where the number of individuals has gotten so small that as they have increased in number again, you're really stuck with the genes that were there in that 20 to 30 individuals that you came down to. Now, when we do see low levels of genetic variability like this, we see conservation concerns like low breeding success, right? Not being able to get pregnant or take those pregnancies to term, as well as high infant and youth mortality. So not being able to take those infants through to their own reproductive age. And again, seeing that low level of genetic variation is fairly common in endangered species. Now, if we move on from thinking about genetic variation, so variation at that lowest level that we can possibly look at, we can also look at richness of species. So a species, right, there's a lot of different ways to define what a species is, and it really depends on what organism we're talking about. One of the common ways of thinking about it is that it's reproductively isolated. So humans can't breed with any other organism out there, therefore we're a species. Like I said, though, there are other ways of thinking about that, but if we think about species, a lot of the time it's a really tidy unit of how we can think about those individuals. The number of species is not even throughout the world, right? We don't have the same number of species at the North Pole as we do at the equator. We do see that increase in species richness towards the tropics. And this is true at different levels as well. So if you were to group all like species together into a genus, we see an increase in the number of genera near the equator. If you were to group all those similar genera into a family, we would also see increased numbers of families towards the equator. So that's a common trend that we see around the world. So aside from looking at that richness at the genetic or at the species level, we can also look at ecosystem richness itself. So we define about 200 different ecosystem types around the world. And if you look at these two images here, they're quite disparate, right? They're very, very different. Left-hand side, we have the Amazon rainforest. Within this image, you're going to have dozens of species of trees. On each species of tree, you're going to have parasitic plants that live on just that tree. You're going to have insects that are supported by that tree. You're also going to have mammals and birds that live and feed on those trees. And then we have other things like bacteria and viruses and fungi that travel through these higher organisms as well. So lots of species, lots of relationships in a complex ecosystem like that on the left. Whereas if we look at on the right-hand side, sea ice, this is an ecosystem all by itself. And I've talked about sea ice in the past. It's not that there's nothing there. You know, we find algae, we find zooplankton, fish, seals, and polar bears. But there's also far, far, far fewer species that we're going to find in a habitat like that compared to the Amazon rainforest. And because there are fewer species, that also means that there are fewer relationships between species and less complexity overall. So when we're talking about ecosystem richness, we're looking at both the complexity within those ecosystems, as well as how many different ecosystems there are around the world. Now, that's been a really brief look at a really, really big concept. As we move through and talk about different aspects of biodiversity, we're mostly going to be talking about that species-specific biodiversity, conservation, and knowledge. But I do want you to keep in mind that biodiversity is not defined just by how many species we have on Earth. It's this really big, all-encompassing topic. Now, but why do we even talk about this, right? Why is it important? Well, there's really two big reasons why we recognize biodiversity is important, and I'm sure I don't really need to explain the first one to you, right? Biodiversity is important for inherent reasons, right? We recognize that each individual organism, each individual species or family has the right to life as much as any other species has the right to exist on this planet. We also know that, if we consider biodiversity philosophically, it's really looking at the knowledge learned by all of the evolving species over these millions of years that we've had a complex life on this planet, and all the different ways that life is found to deal with those varying environmental conditions that happen on the planet now or on the planet in the past. So it's a lot of knowledge that is contained within the genes of these organisms. Now, if you're trying to explain to somebody who doesn't care whether or not a particular lichen exists about why it's important, there's of course also the pragmatic reasons, so reasons that benefit humans. On a really easy way to explain, right? We have two different crops here on the right-hand side. On the top, we've got wheat, and on the bottom, we have rice. Now, wheat and rice are both heavily cultivated grains. You find them around the world, and they've been bred to produce a lot of grain. Now, as we see increasing droughts or increasing levels of salt in the soil, what scientists are having to do is go back into nature to find the original template for those species and look for examples of where already in the wild those drought-tolerant genes or those salt-tolerant genes may already exist, and then incorporating those genes into our foodstuffs, right? So that on the bottom you can see a common cultivar of rice on the right-hand side, put into salty soil, dies. When we see a cultivar that's incorporated those salt-tolerant genes on the left-hand side, it still goes on to produce a healthy plant. If we think about the Amazon rainforest, it's home to an estimated 80,000 plants, many of which are not well described or at least poorly studied. We also know that 25% of the world's pharmaceuticals were originally isolated from plants in the Amazon. And of course, the ongoing question, how many more might be out there that we don't even know about yet? There's financial reasons for preserving biodiversity, because as we have more diverse ecosystems, we also preserve those ecosystem processes. A common theme in this is water filtration. So if you need to filter water for your city or for your town or for yourself, you can either build some extensive water filtration plants, or you can protect the wetlands and the streams and the lakes that feed into your watershed. New York City actually is a really good example of a city that had to decide which way they wanted to go on this. And instead of spending the money on a new water filtration plant back in the mid-90s, they decided to invest about a quarter of that money into preserving the watershed and the natural ecosystem processes, and ended up getting that same high quality water, spending less money and ending up with a better, not just good water for the people who live in New York City, but also a nicer environment for all those other organisms and people living in the rest of the watershed. So lots of important reasons for humans, besides all those inherent reasons as to why biodiversity is important. Now, has the planet always been as diverse as it is right now? Short answer, no, it has not, right? For the first 4 billion years or so of our planet's history, we had either no life or simple unicellular life. Starting off from that Cambrian explosion, as you can see on the right-hand side, that graph is tracking the number of families of all families that we know of that have been found at different times throughout the Earth's history. And the overall trend has been for increasing diversity over time, whether you're measuring at the species level, the genus level, the family level, whatever level you're measuring at. Now, there are, of course, you can see those big blips. We have had large extinction events, most famously, of course, with our dinosaurs. But over time, we do see new species coming in to either fill those same niches or at least add to that diversity of life on Earth. So has Earth always been as diverse as it is right now? No. Has it always looked the same? No, that diversity and those components have changed over time, but we do see that Earth right now is an extremely diverse place. And just to dial in a little bit further here, I've got two graphs here looking at vertebrate diversity and plant diversity. With the vertebrates, you can see that sometimes we have groups that come up in the purple on the left-hand side. Those are our jawless vertebrates. Those went extinct, but we did have other groups that evolved from there or evolved from other groups as well. So giving us those sharks, the amphibians, the mammals, the birds, all those things. And we see that again, that increasing diversity. Same thing with the plants. You know, in that Paleozoic, we had green algae, we had liverworts. Diversity exploded, giving us cycads and ginkgos and ferns, and later on our angiosperms, our flowering plants. And again, that trend is always to, you know, for that increasing diversity and for novel or new species that appear over time. Now, that doesn't mean that we have a great understanding of what's out there on our planet right now. On Earth right now, we have approximately 1.7 million described species. So ones where scientists have isolated and been able to describe the characters of those species. The estimates of how many species might live on this planet, aside from that, agree on somewhere between 10 and 12 million as an estimate. So we have only identified a fraction of what is out there. And the things that we know best, you can see on the bottom there, the vertebrates, we've described, we think, nearly all the vertebrates. We've described nearly all the plants, even though we don't know some of them very well. Things that we haven't described well, spiders, insects, fungi. You know, we often think about the age that we live in as the age of mammals. We know that there are about 5,500 species globally of mammals. That's a good number, and we're pretty important. We're all over the place. But if we had to, if we were in the future looking back and trying to describe the age that we're in right now, you would probably call it the age of insects. There's somewhere probably around 8 million species of insects, and we've only described a very, very small fraction of those insects. As I mentioned before, that diversity is not equal around the planet, right? If you go up to the poles, you're going to find fewer species that you're going to find down towards the equator. The slide that you're looking at right here is, it looks so simple, sort of, to look at it. There's a lot of dots, and I'll explain what those dots are. But what I want you to know is that this is years and years of research and knowledge that have gone into giving you this set of curves. And this is two curves. On the top, we're looking at the land mammals. On the bottom, we're looking at the sea mammals. So we're only talking mammals. This was a large meta-study involving hundreds of researchers over years and years of work. They divided up the Earth into these equally sized cells and said, okay, in each cell, how many mammals can be found there? And they did this over the Earth, the land as well as the sea. And we got these two curves showing that, you know, we can see here for that, the land mammals on the top, that we have greatest diversity around that 0 mark, which is at the equator, and that we have very little diversity of mammals in that northern hemisphere north of 60 degrees. Very, very similar thing for those sea mammals, increasing diversity at the equator, decreasing diversity as you move towards the poles. Now, when we start talking about biological hotspots and where we can find those greatest points of diversity, you can start to think to yourself, okay, she's telling me that most of our diversity is at the equator. Probably a lot of our hotspots are going to be at the equator as well. And in general, you're going to be right. As to why that is, there's a lot of theories. It's not 100% understood. Obviously, the last round of glaciation shifted a lot of stuff out of those higher latitudes, didn't touch the equator. So it's got a relatively stable climate. It's got lots of water. It's got lots of sunlight. It's got lots of plants. It's probably just an easier place for species to live and not die off as rapidly. But like I say, there are lots of theories to explain why there are so many more species in the tropics than there are at the poles. So, biodiversity hotspots, I said, you're not going to find them towards the poles, and here, look at this, we're not. So hotspots, they're not just, they're actually quite well defined as to what we need to have to call a place a hotspot. It's a relatively new concept. They were first defined by a biologist by the name of Myers in 1988. And the idea behind finding these hotspots was twofold. It was firstly to identify those regions where we find a disproportionate amount of the species on Earth. But secondly, to also identify those regions where that diversity is threatened by human alterations to the landscape. So these days, we recognize 36 global hotspots, and you can see where they are on this map here. They're mostly found in the tropical and subtropical regions. Hotspots are defined in two ways. Firstly, by containing a minimum of 1,500 species of endemic vascular plants. So those are plants that are native to the area and found nowhere else on Earth. And that at least 70% of the area of that native vegetation has been lost. So we're seeking out to identify those areas that have not just high levels of diversity, but also threats to that diversity. And while we are defining these hotspots by the presence of certain species of plants, because we're capturing those very diverse areas anyway, we also see that while we're only talking about 2.4% of the planet's surface, that it actually includes about 60% of the world's plant, bird, mammal, reptile, and amphibian species. So I want to take a minute and go through a few of these different hotspots. Obviously, we don't have time to go through all 36 of them. So I picked the ones that I thought were either really familiar to you or possibly not very familiar. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the California Floristic province. So some of you may live there or may have been there. It was designated as a hotspot in 1996. It's got a Mediterranean-style climate. It's characterized by hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters on average. And if you've been there, you know that this area isn't all homogeneous, right? We've got deserts, we've got those coastal forests, we have grasslands. It's a very large area, and it's home to 7,031 species of vascular plants, of which 2,153 are endemic, so only found in that area. Obviously, you can see it covers a huge amount of California, over 70% of California. And of course, because California is such a wonderful, popular place for humans to live, we see that only about 24% of that area still retains its native vegetation. So nicely fits within our definition of hotspot. Now, remember I said that there were over 2,000 species of endemic plants, so we can't go through all of them, but I wanted to just point out a few of those endemics that I think are really neat. This is the Santa Rosa Island Manzanita. It's a shrub that grows only on the sandstone bluffs, the Santa Rosa Island in the Channel Islands. There are only a few individuals of this plant left at 2 locations, and it is a federally endangered species. Another one that I've been lucky enough to see myself is called the Point Reyes bird's beak. So this is a small shrubby plant. It's only about a foot tall, and that's what's known as a halophyte. So it actually prefers those salty soils. It grows in coastal marshes and inland in the Great Basin area as well. You can see it's got green leaves, but it's actually what's called a hemiparasite. So it does produce its own sugars and its own chlorophyll to capture sunlight, but it also inserts these parasitic roots into other plants to suck up their nutrients. Another cool thing it does is you can see how it looks almost grainy on top. That is salt. So I said it grows in those salty areas, so it will actually concentrate and push that salt out onto its foliage. So it's not a good grazing species for anything. It tends to sit fairly unworried by anything else around it, but it is endangered and found in only a few localities as well. Now, of course, with the hotspots, we're only tracking officially those vascular plant species, but we know that we are capturing a lot of animal species within these areas too. So this individual is what's called an island fox. These also live on those channel islands, and there are multiple subspecies on each channel island. They are descended from the gray fox on the mainland, and they were separated from the gray fox around 15,000 years ago. They are very small individuals compared to what you're going to find on the mainland, and they are also federally endangered. Birds, of course, count as well. We say that we're capturing birds within this interest as well. So this is the San Clemente Loggerhead Trike. It's only found on the island of San Clemente, which is administered by the US Navy. So it's been highly affected by introduced species. At one point, this bird's population got as low as 20 individuals. With support of a captive breeding program, they estimate that there's around 40 to 60 breeding pairs in the wild right now, which is considered to be a nice stable level. I mentioned the loggerhead shrike in combination with that fox because those species recoveries have actually been very impacted by each other. To support the recovery of this shrike on San Clemente Island, they were actually trapping and removing the foxes from that island. So to save one, you were making that other one quite heavily impacted. But since that bird has recovered, the foxes are no longer being removed from the island. Now, if you're from California or you've ever visited California, it is an area that can be incredibly proud of the measures it has taken to protect these lands. California actually has over 47% of its land area protected, either by state or federal agencies or various conservation nonprofits. And this includes almost 1/3 of the length of the coastline. It's a number that blows me away every time I think about it, to know that there are so many protected areas in this one state. And it's not only at the state and federal level, but there's a lot of care shown by the people of California to get out there and find those diverse areas. I've never met people or places that are more caring about those natural environments. Now, I want to take us all the way around the world right now to South Africa. This is somewhere I have not gotten to go, but it is on, I would say it's top of my personal bucket list. And this is probably known as the world's most famous hotspot, or sometimes called the hottest hotspot on the planet. So like what we saw in California, we're not just seeing one homogeneous piece of land. It's a lot of associated habitats that come together. One of the typical kinds of habitats we see here is called the Finbos Vegetation, where the plants are very fine-leaved and very hard. And because of that incredible amount of sunlight that comes in here, the leaves are actually oriented parallel to the sunlight, so they're not getting that direct sunlight. It's also hot, dry, just like California, and it's also evolved with a fire cycle. Now, this area, as part of the Cape Floristic region, it is less than 0.5% of the land cover of Africa, but contains 20% of the continent's flora. There are over 9,000 species of plants that are found here, of which 70% are not found anywhere else on the planet. And just to really hammer in on how unique this area is, it's not just recognized as a floral province, but actually as a floral kingdom. So there are families here that don't exist anywhere else on Earth. To give you an idea, another floral kingdom, there are 6 on Earth. North America, Europe, Russia, North Africa, that is all a single floral kingdom. And here we're talking about this really, really tiny area that is unique enough from everything else on Earth to be its own kingdom. Now, again, to show you some of the species that we find here, this is called Gysaloma marginatum. This is xerophytes, so it lives in very hot, arid areas, and it actually lives in areas with a lot of aluminum in the soil and accumulates that aluminum within its tissues. It's a very unique species, and it's the only species found within its family, so it doesn't have any close relatives. In a similar situation is the next plant we're going to look at, which is called Retzia Capensis, or the honey flower. Should be coming up right away. There it is. So this is, again, the only species within its family. Keeping with this trend of extreme uniqueness in the area, one of the birds that feeds on the nectar from those honey flowers is this orange-breasted sunbird, and it is the only species within its genus. This is, of course, being all showy and colorful. This is a male example of the orange-breasted sunbird. Now, going on and looking at some of the other unique species in the area, the next one that you're going to see here is a flower. So this is the king Protea flower, also South Africa's national flower. More properly, it's an inflorescence, so it's a whole bunch of little flowers jammed together, similar to what you see in a sunflower. And it's up to about a foot across in size. We have very unique mammals in the area as well. So this is called a Vanzil golden mole. It is an endangered mole. It's endemic. It's not found anywhere else on Earth. Like a lot of other moles, though, it doesn't have visible eyes or ears. There are eyes present, but they're covered by an unbroken layer of skin. It's one of the smaller moles on Earth and only about 3 inches long. Back to the plants. Going to take you next to look at an orchid. This is the red disa. You might see it sometimes as cultivars. It is sold around the world as a popular hothouse orchid. It grows near waterfalls, streams, and mountain seeps. And it is it's again, very unique. It only has a single pollinator known as the mountain pride butterfly. It's a very large butterfly that's attracted to red flowers. And this butterfly pollinates 15 species of red flowers and is crucial to the survival of all of those 15 species. Now, another unique animal from the area is what we're going to see coming up next. It's called the Geometric Tortoise. This is a critically endangered, as well as endemic, not found anywhere else on Earth, one of the rarest tortoise species in the world. It was actually believed to be extinct in the 1960s, with a surviving population that was found in 1972. It is, again, a smallish individual, so it's only about 6 inches wide at full size. Now, these are only a very, very small snapshot of all the unique forms of life present in this area. And to recognize this, it has been labeled a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Wanted to point out the protected areas here. So the green and red are all components of the World Heritage Site and adds up to a protected area of around 11,000 square kilometers. If you can see those brown zones there, those are privately owned buffer zones where they have supportive mechanisms in place to reduce the amount of impact by human activity. Now, as the third hotspot I wanted to look at is the newest hotspot, and it's actually also found in the US. Remember I said that there are 36 global hotspots. Only 10 of these were originally identified and adopted by Conservation International. In 1995, after reviewing material, the number was increased to 25 and then 34 and later on. The final 2 that were added were in 2011, the forests of East Australia, and then only in 2016, the North American coastal plain. Now think about, that's only 5 years ago. This is so recently. And it still blows my mind that how it is that we're only realizing now where our hotspots are. This particular one, initially, it wasn't even thought of as a potential for a hotspot because it's been so heavily modified already by human activity. And it doesn't seem to be, when you look at it at first, very diverse in habitats. We also thought that probably during the last glaciation, it pushed a lot of those species out of there, and so we wouldn't be seeing a lot that's still present. But we have learned otherwise. So based on the fossil pollen record, it actually showed that the forests, so these pine savanna forests that we find down in Florida and Georgia and through Tennessee, they were originally thought by humans to have been a modified landscape. So humans came in, burned the landscape for the purposes of cultivation, but these are actually natural landscapes caused by lightning strikes. That's actually the area with the highest concentration of lightning strikes in the world. So these pine savannas that we thought were only here because of human activity are actually a natural ecosystem. Further studies also showed that this region is actually the global hotspot for turtle species richness. So this here is the Florida softshell turtle. So in the US, there are 2 species of federally protected lichens, and they are both found in Florida. So they're actually found, they're within the same family. And again, they've only been protected fairly recently. It takes us to that age-old problem in conservation, that if you don't know what's there, you can't adequately protect them. You, or any one of us, could have the most rare bird on the planet, nesting in your backyard. But if you don't know what rare birds are, you're never going to know that it's there. You're not going to be able to change your own behavior to protect that species. So scientists, governments, industry all play an important role in discovering where these rare species and where this diversity is. But what I really want to talk about first is projects that we can all get involved in, because tracking biodiversity is everybody's business. One of the common ways that probably a lot of you have heard about is the backyard bird count, or the Christmas bird count, which is one of the largest and best known citizen science biodiversity projects. So this has been going since 1998 and has been going since 2013 in the entirety of the world. All of the data collected from this comes from people just like you and I, who go out, look at birds for 15 minutes or 4 hours, and log that data into eBird, which is the world's largest biodiversity citizen science project. There's training available. It's relatively easy to get into. And we can also look at things that are called bioblitzes. These are held in national parks or in regional parks. And what they are is expert-led public biodiversity surveys. They might be targeted to a certain group, so you might just be going out to look for plants or lichens or butterflies or birds. But what they're meant to do is get a lot of eyes on the ground in a certain area all at once. Expert hobbyists or scientists work alongside teams of volunteers, and you go out and you just collect data. And it's this kind of data like this that really provides us those big picture snapshots, so we can get information on what those biodiversity hotspots are, so we can know where our conservation efforts are both focused. And I participated in a lot of these, and it's just incredibly amazing how much data and new data you can get from an event like this. I have never been on a BioBlitz that hasn't found new species to the area. So we can always improve on our knowledge. Now, like I said, it's not just those of us who go out and look for plants and animals or birds. Industry and government has to play its part as well. And this is a project that I was involved in for many years. So I wanted to kind of focus on this and tell you about some of the things that happened around the world. One of the world leaders in bringing industry and government together to track biodiversity is the province of Alberta within Canada. You know, Alberta is sometimes best known for its cowboys and its oil, but it's also the world leader in tracking that biodiversity. And starting in the early 2000s, established this Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. Around the province, spaced out at 20-kilometer intervals, are these 1 hectare, so 100 meter by 100 meter sites, where at each site, technicians descend an average of every 5 years to each site, and they log everything within that site, and then return 5 years later and do it again, and return 5 years later and do it again. So not only is Alberta giving an idea of what species are found there, but they're also able to track the changes that they see on the ground as those species might change because of human impact to those areas. So there are smaller projects in different regions as well, but we all look to Alberta as that leader in how we can bring government and industry together. It's been groundbreaking not only in just what it's done, but in bringing industry into it as well, so that we're getting that same data collected, whether people are going out to do a survey for a new oil well going in, or they're doing a survey as part of the regular monitoring efforts. So just an incredible amount of data coming out of this. Now, when we look at the global stage, so around the world, global conservation efforts are always complicated by the fact that every country does its own thing to a certain point, right? So all the more reasons why we should be able to celebrate when countries agree on a particular system. One of the big systems that we have in place globally is the IUCN, or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, Red List. So the Red List is a list of all species around the world that are at risk of extinction. And that Red List is used by governments, by industry, by planners around the world to understand the environmental impacts. Now, I use this regularly in my own work, so I work as a botanist as well. On a project that might be going in, every single species that we go out and we find at a project site gets checked against this list. And it's assessed against this global list, but also that then is detected, no questions. Is this a species at no risk that can, we can put a road in here, or is it somewhere in between and we need to mitigate for that kind of problem? Now, another global kind of celebration, or another global thing we can celebrate, is the Convention on Biological Diversity. There are 196 member countries of this convention, and this has been present since 1993. This convention aims to conserve biodiversity, but also to find sustainable uses for the components of biodiversity. There were a lot of targets that were set to reach by 2020, and now that we're in 2021, they've been examined and we've looked for what our successes have been. In shorts, a lot of the targets have not been reached, but we do know that if these targets had not been put in place and if efforts had not gone in, that we would have seen extinction levels of species probably 4 times higher than what we did see. So while we haven't seen the successes that we wanted to see, we have seen that these global initiatives like this can make a real difference in what we're seeing on the ground. Now, remember that when we're identifying those hotspots, we're not looking just at where they are and what's in them. We're also looking at what the risk is relative to the human impact of those areas. And one of the best ways that we can learn to live with nature is by figuring out what nature is there, but also working to find sustainable ways to protect that nature. So letting humans still be humans, still do the things we need to do, while protecting the biological diversity in this area. And a world leader in this front is the Unesco Biosphere Reserves. And you may or may not be familiar with what these are. First thing I want to do here is show you where those green dots are on the map. Look at how well they line up with where our biodiversity hotspots were. So there's some outside that region, but we see that a lot of those biosphere reserves are in those regions where we see high levels of human habitation and therefore high levels of human impact on those species. Now, I happen to actually live in a biosphere reserve, and it's meant to be a model of a functioning, diverse ecosystem. All biosphere reserves have 3 areas: a core area, which is usually a national park or an other protected area, a buffer region, and an outer transition. The goal really is, like I said, to preserve that biological diversity while also providing opportunities to explore approaches to sustainable development. And what I think one of the coolest things about biosphere reserves is that they're driven by the people who live here. UNESCO doesn't come in and plop a biosphere reserve down. This is driven by the people who live in this high biodiversity area, saying, we recognize this as being important, and we want to make sure that we are protecting this area for ourselves and for our children and our children's children. So we're promoting knowledge sharing in the area, so ways to be better sustainable, reducing poverty, respecting cultural values, and there's also communication between different biosphere reserves so that we're able to learn within our reserve, but also talk to other reserves as well and figure out what works best. And these are started by people just like me and just like you and just like anybody else who has that core area that they think is really important. And if I can leave us with this, the message I always want to leave people with is that so much of this is driven by us. It's driven by people on the ground, whether it's you going out and doing the Christmas bird count, whether it's you taking your grandkids out to go find butterflies in your backyard and sharing that information with iNaturalist or with the researchers in your area, whether it's going out and recognizing that you have a biosphere reserve and finding ways to contribute to that knowledge and to that education of other people. There are so many things that we can do and that people around the world have done to give us that information and that understanding. So if we can, I'm going to hand back to Kendall now. Thank you for tolerating my bandwidth issues today. And yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Eleanor. We stuck with you. It was so fascinating. Thank you so much for this presentation. We do have a few great questions for you, and we'll spend the next 5 or 10 minutes answering some of them. I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question today, you can submit that in your control panel under the questions field. All right, so someone here wants to know where your biosphere is.
Oh, yes, thank you. I live in the Riding Mountain Biosphere Reserve, which surrounds Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba, Canada. So it's not considered a biodiversity hotspot, but it is one of our national parks, so it has that core protected area. And I live within that transitional zone where we still see agricultural usage, but we also see a lot of sustainable development. For example, I live on a farm. We have about 600 acres. About a third of that is actually set aside as conservation land. So we do have a lot of conserved land, even outside that core area of protection. It's a really neat spot, really.
Very cool. So when you say human impact, are you also including climate change in the definition?
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about those hotspots, what we really, it's a very cut and dried qualification. If a hotspot has to contain at least 1,500 endemic vascular plant species and has to have lost at least 70% of its natural plant cover, we usually, that's mostly tracked by just humans going in and modifying the area, whether it's road building, whether it's farms going in, whether it's urban developments. But we also do recognize that climate change also has impacts on whether or not those species can actually still live in their original area. So in short, yes, but that hasn't been a big part of tracking those hotspots to date.
All right. And what are some examples of cross-species breeding?
Oh, I'll tell you my favorite example of cross-species breeding. And Kendall, you might think I'm going to go for the Pizzly bear, the grizzly polar bear hybrid, but actually my personal example, favorite example of cross-species breeding is the Narluga, which is a narwhal beluga hybrid, which has been spotted in the wild at least twice.
Wow, that is very cool. Of course, that's your favorite. So back on the map that you showed with all of the hot spots, could you tell us what the different colors mean?
Oh, sure. And in fact, if I can get it to go quickly enough. Oh, no, of course not. I was going to say I will try to bring it back up so I can point them out.
Sure, sure.
So they're kind of showing you the peak areas of diversity. So you can see that there's some darker areas going to an orange, going to a light yellow. So while the criteria is that you have to have at least 1,500 species of endemic plants, we know that some areas like the Cape area, the Cape Floristic region, have upwards of 6,500. So you'll see it in a darker region. Basically, the darker it is, the more endemic species you have. They all qualify as hotspots, but some of those hotspots are smoking hot.
All right, and you had mentioned 31 native turtle species. Someone was wondering where that was.
Oh, 41 actually in Florida. Florida has 41 native turtle species. Who would have thought, right? Like,
that's incredible. Yeah,
that's incredible.
So someone just submitted 70% plant loss is really high. It seems like recovery would be difficult. Can't that percentage be lowered?
Well, it does in some ways, right? But keep in mind that we are talking about large areas. So all those hotspots put together do cover about 15.5% of the entire land area of the Earth. So it is a big area. And when that hotspot qualification was first being developed, like I said, they were looking for not just where are those biodiversity hotspots, but where are they most at risk. So using that 70% threshold has gotten us to where we are right now. I think if we were to lower that threshold and say like, well, what if we had 60% loss or 50% loss? Would we include more areas? Actually, probably not, for a few reasons. I live right on the boundary of the prairie ecosystem. Okay, so the prairies are another heavily modified ecosystem. It's actually lost about 97% of its original plant cover. But does it contain over 1,500 endemic species? Not even close. Like, we just don't have that diversity in these other impacted areas to say that it's worth maybe at least recognizing on a global scale. Do we have, like in my area, we do have those prairie reserves, so they are set aside locally, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's worthwhile recognizing on a global stage. We can argue about that. Like, there's always so many different priorities that we can look at for conservation. But in short, we just don't see that same level of endemism. We would not get the same bang for our buck protecting other areas if what we're trying to do is focus on just number of species.
Mm-hmm. All right, that makes total sense. Thank you. All right, well, I'm going to call it there with questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question. I'm very sorry we didn't have time to get to everything today. Eleanor, thank you so much. We stuck with you today. I know it was stressful to lose your internet a couple times, but it was a wonderful presentation, and I'm so glad you were able to finish. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Thanks, Kendall, and thanks everybody so much for sticking with me. Those windy days sure play havoc, but I really want to thank you so much for spending time with me today. And if I can encourage you to do any one thing today, it's to think about how we can all support those biodiversity initiatives. Go out, go bird watching, go find some plants, go join your local butterfly society. There are so many resources that we have as individuals to make a real difference at a local stage as well as on that global stage. So never think that there isn't anything that we can do, because there absolutely is.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful message. Thank you so much, Eleanor. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.